Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this February 16th session of the ABA Legal Education Police Practices Consortium Fellowship meeting. All of those words will eventually come more smoothly off of my tongue, but apparently today is not that day. It is a lovely day here in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be joined by our fellows, as well as Jonathan Wender and Prathi Chowdhury, who are joining us today from Polis Solutions. Um, as I have talked about with our fellows on previous occasions, our focus for this semester is on examining the role of artificial intelligence as well as larger policing technology as it relates to public safety in the hopes of answering the question throughout the semester, in what ways does technology promote and or hinder engagement between police and the community? Last week, we had a riveting presentation from Professor Andrew Ferguson from American University, Washington College of Law, who talked to us a bit about the grounding of predictive policing and the Fourth Amendment. And so I reached out initially to Jonathan, who is an older, I won't say old, an older friend of the ABA's criminal justice section who's previously featured on one of the Just Pods podcasts, I think 2 years ago, highlighting some of the work of his organization. But I was really keen to get a deeper dive into body worn camera policies, how we are using this technology, how we are assessing if this is working, and trying to determine if and how the footage from BWCs, so we don't have to keep using the full drawn out name, how we are ensuring if and how we are ensuring that that technology is working, both in service and safety to the officers themselves, as well as the communities that they police. And so recognizing that is the basis of the work that Polis Solutions is undertaking, thought why not go to the experts themselves and invite them to present on the great work that they're undertaking, as well as some of the early lessons that they are learning and how it may apply to our larger question for this semester. So, Jonathan, Prathi, thank you so much for joining us today. I hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Jesslyn, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again for giving us the opportunity to talk with all of you, and hopefully we'll have some more folks jumping on here. I know we had sort of a contradiction in timing, so maybe we'll get some additional folks at the top of the hour. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to me and sort of lay some of my own presuppositions on the table and yield to Prathi, and then we'll dive into the weeds. I'm a decidedly improbable combination of entrepreneur, social scientist, and police veteran. I served for 20 years in the Seattle area, and on the academic side, I'm a social scientist whose great passion is face-to-face human interaction in situations where risk is high and trust is low. When I left the policing world, I worked at DARPA for several years and was on the faculty at the University of Washington in the Department of Sociology and the Law Societies and Justice programs. A lot of my former students are attorneys. What I want to say before I say anything else, because I think it's very important with anything related to the law and policy, let me lay one of my interests on the table. Polis Solutions is pioneering the use of multimodal artificial intelligence to automatically analyze body-worn camera footage. I have a vested professional and commercial interest in seeing that succeed. At the same time, I want to be honest with you in saying that as a human being, as an intellectual, I have deep reticence about what technology can and can't do, right? So to begin with something that at first blush might seem like a contradiction, for my colleagues and me, the real promise of AI is that it can humanize policing. And by looking at a massive amount of data, I'm just going to give you one quick image to think about, and then I'll yield to Prathi for her intro. I think you're all familiar with these amazing pictures of deep space that have come back from the Webb telescope. That telescope has given us insights into the birth of the universe, the evolution of the universe in ways we never had thought possible before. Without cleaving to some conceit that what we do is that good, I think it offers a nice metaphor for what we think we can do with body-worn camera footage, right? We can lay bare the wonder and complexity of this amazing corpus of data about human interactions, and in so doing, give communities and police departments and other organizations actionable insights into how to make those interactions more safe, more just, and more effective. So that's really what we do. And I would ask all of you as we go through this conversation, continue to reflect on some of your own axiomatic presuppositions, continue to think about, as all of you as attorneys, your current or aspiring, think about the good and bad in your own arguments. And, I just want to invite you to join Prothy and me on this journey of, we hope, intellectual and legal ambition to try to make things better. So Prothy, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Prathi Chowdhury. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. And I am an attorney, and I'll give you a little bit of my background. I'm actually originally from Maryland, went to law school in Baltimore, University of Maryland. And then I moved up to New York, where I worked for the New York City Law Department doing Section 1983 cases, which I would think in your group you would know what that is, but just in case you don't, I'm not familiar if you don't, but it would be defense of NYPD and use of force, excessive force, malicious prosecution cases in federal court in New York. All the cases, most of the cases were high profile. Many of them would end up in the Times or the Daily News or whatnot. It was a very fast-paced, moving environment. And it taught me an enormous amount about policing. And I, through that process, met so many police officers, NYPD officers. After working there, I moved into private practice. And then I joined a company that develops police law enforcement policy, in addition to other kinds of public safety policy. My thinking when I had joined that company originally was that I had been a defense attorney for so many years. Wouldn't it be nice to be proactive and get ahead of the problems? Like, why deal with a situation after it's gone south? Let's try and get ahead of the problem and write proper policies before that situation goes south. And it's very much that same line of thinking that drew me to Polis and got me so interested in their journey, which is very much let's get ahead of the problem and try to fix this. We can talk about this ad nauseum, or we can do something about it. I'll tell you, part of my background growing up just outside of Baltimore and living in Baltimore, it gave us in my general student community a certain perception of police that I was so sure about. And then I went up to New York and was like, how am I going to have this job where I defend the NYPD? And my eyes opened over years, and that hundreds of depositions later and multiple trials later, I thought, oh, well, this is much more complicated than I thought. Not to say anything is all good or all bad. Obviously, all of you in this, kind of in this fellowship would know that there's no such thing. But it definitely opened my eyes up to what I didn't know. And then moving on from that to my next job and my next job, you continue to realize how much you don't know. And I think it's a really interesting transition to talk about the technology that Jonathan's company has here today, because the sheer amount of data out there should make all of us pause and think about what we don't know, right? We see certain footage on TV. We know our own personal experiences with law enforcement. And isn't that just like a snippet of what's actually going on there? So wouldn't it be great to actually have an idea of what's going on there? So hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the background of laws and a more emerging technology and give you guys some principles that you can apply in the future. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Prothy. So a couple of unintended symbolic things in my dress and background today, but as we sort of transition to the proposition, we want to wander into the weeds, hence the nice grass behind me. And as it happens, I just grabbed this gray polo shirt, but gray in many ways is my favorite color to wear when I'm talking about policing, because there's very little in policing that is unambiguous, admitting of a binary answer, yes or no, right or wrong, black or white. If the contrary were true, all of us on here on this call would be unemployed, out of school, and doing something else. So, I take it for granted that everything we're talking about here involves lots of shades of gray, lots of legal, moral, ethical, and social complexity. And it's with that spirit that I want to dive into this. So now I'm going to try to share my screen and show you PowerPoints, because, lo and behold, what would any of this be without PowerPoints? I personally detest PowerPoint, and I would rather just talk to you, but the dictates of academia being what they are, here we go. Can you guys see this? All right. So let me put this in presentation mode and we're off to the races. All right, here we go. So I want to begin with some opening assumptions that at least Prathi and I bring to the table. First of all, I think there are a lot of unexamined narratives around policing that fundamentally distort the way we think and talk about body-worn camera law and policy. And I think those unexamined narratives sit at both ends of the spectrum. So without going too far into the weeds, there are a lot of people from the legal and policy world who come to the table believing, often with good intention, usually with good intention, that the police are freighted with all kinds of moral and political baggage that fundamentally undermines their legitimacy. At the other end of the spectrum, you have cops who are in this defensive crouch and feel unloved and unappreciated by the world. And by the way, I take it as sort of an unwritten rule of social interaction that you get to make fun of any group to which you belong. So I will, throughout this conversation, insult both the police and professional academics, to both of which groups I belong, proudly, but sometimes cringily. So we also take it for granted that there is no such thing as neutral technology. Everything that people have ever invented is born in a certain social, historical, and political context. Body-worn cameras and AI are no different. We also take it for granted that technology, especially in the modern world, is always going to evolve faster than law and ethics and policy can keep up with. I also think, and I'm sort of conjuring up in my mind some recent conversations I've had with friends in the legal world, I don't think that technology can be cabined off through legislation or some sleight of hand with policy. The use of technology can and should be regulated in a number of different ways, but there's no putting the proverbial genie back in the bottle. And as you're going to hear Prathi and me say several times throughout this presentation, the ostrich head in the sand approach doesn't work for anybody. So really, more than anything else, I want to make clear from the outset, from the early moments of this conversation, we don't have perfect answers to things we're talking about here today. What we want to try to get you to do is think about some of the same questions that we do, that our team does, get you to think about how we can take some initial steps toward greater trust and greater common ground in this very fraught and complicated space around what to do with body-worn camera data. This sounds like a truism from some undergrad class or even high school social studies, but I think it's worth highlighting. If there's going to be any progress on matters of law and policy, especially as sensitive as something like dealing with body-worn camera footage, there has to be greater trust and common ground. And to give a nod to what Jesslyn was saying about the strange world in which we live socially and politically, anything that can move people toward consensus, anything that can challenge rigid orthodoxies and bring people to center, I think is setting conditions for progress. But I can tell you, I firmly believe, on the one hand, I think the technology that my colleagues and I have developed is really good technology, but I don't think any technology can stand on its own, right? The technology at the end of the day is no better than the people who use it. So telling you that there's raw potential to use AI leaves the question begging, well, what do we do with this AI? As Prathi and I were talking about earlier today, and back to what I said about the Webb telescope, the telescope itself is amazingly powerful, but the telescope only works because of the vision of cosmologists and physicists and astronomers and other people who take that amazing flow of data and do things with it that make sense not just to the world of science, but to lay people like all of us who look at those images and think in radically new ways about what the cosmos is really all about. So let's talk a little bit about body-worn cameras, and a caveat, as Prathi said, I don't know what people's areas of expertise are in this call. I don't know what you don't do or don't know about AI or cameras or policing. So there's no intent here to cover ground you've already trod or to condescend, but I'm just going to speak in generalities, and we can always flesh things out in the Q&A. So as I think most folks on the call are aware, body-worn cameras are a little camera that sits on officers' uniforms, and they record audio and video data. That data is stored in two ways with large departments. It almost always sits in the cloud. And for many smaller agencies, that data is stored on local servers physically located in the basement of the police department or somewhere adjacent to it. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody on this call, in this conversation. The use of the cameras has proliferated over the past decade, and we're now in a position where most officers in the US wear body-worn cameras. Despite the fact that there are millions and millions of hours of video being vacuumed up in this country every day, almost none of it is ever analyzed for reasons I'll explain here in a moment. But just to give you an example of scale, the NYPD, by its own estimate, records about 10 to 12 million videos a year with a 5-year retention period, and that's just the NYPD. And so up until very recently, there was really no tractable way to do anything with this data, which languishes at great expense on servers where it's only haphazardly analyzed randomly, or it is on other occasions looked at with more laser-like precision for internal investigations to adjudicate criminal cases and so on. I want to talk a little bit about the present benefits of body-worn cameras, what they have generally proven to be, what they haven't proven to be, and pivot from that to how we think about the data. So people generally agree that the cameras offer the benefit of greater accountability and greater transparency. And I want to sort of offer up an emotional and political thought here. The cameras, at the end of the day, at present, right or wrong, good or bad, they are an ornament or a symbol of mistrust. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a nurse, and she and I were discussing, well, why do cops wear cameras and nurses don't? Now, as lawyers, you might say, well, HIPAA. But the real answer is trust, right? People generally assume that they and their healthcare providers share a set of common goals. So we don't put cameras on airline pilots and doctors and lawyers and nurses and dentists and so forth. We put them on cops. And one of the things that my colleagues and I try to do, as much as we advance the technology, we're trying to get stakeholders of all positions to take a more capacious view of what the cameras can and should do, beyond simply treating them as a gotcha tool. And treating them as a gotcha tool, treating them as an ornament of mistrust really goes back to my opening point, which is that body-worn camera law and policy are freighted with assumptions about policing that don't really bottom out on either on research or on the lived experience of the vast majority of people in America and the rest of the world. So accountability and transparency, fairly self-evident what those are about with camera data. Obviously, the cameras also have evidentiary data, which is pretty well exploited. I think the criminal justice system, and I will defer to Prathi later to talk about this, but the system does a pretty good job of using the evidence to adjudicate cases. The big question people have wondered for a decade or longer is, so do the cameras change what officers and community members actually do on the street? And we really don't know. One of my colleagues, Cynthia Lum, who teaches at George Mason, who's, if you ask me to pick one person in America who's done the state-of-the-art research on body-worn cameras and their effects, it's Cynthia. If you look at all the studies that have been done on body-worn cameras, do they work, do they not? Cynthia and some of her colleagues generally believe we don't know. It's a coin toss. And measured against the cost of body-worn cameras, it's a very expensive coin toss, right? So if you are a community, especially one that isn't so affluent, why should you put cameras on the street? Up to this point, and here I'm gonna quote Deborah Witzberg, who is in the Inspector General's office in Chicago. She has this wonderful line that if we're not doing something with the data, if we're not reviewing it appropriately, it's nothing but a high-tech vest ornament, right? It's just this ornament that signals to the community, yes, we're watching the officers, don't worry, we're looking for all kinds of mismal and nonfeasance, fear not. I think that is an ethically, politically, and scientifically constrained way to look at things. And again, if you'll forgive the pun, we're trying to widen the aperture and really get society to think more broadly about what we can do with all of this data, which is unprecedented both quantitatively and qualitatively. This may not occur to you at first blush, but if you take anything beyond a superficial dive into body-worn cameras, you'll quickly appreciate that body-worn camera video is the single largest source of data in the world on policing. There is absolutely nothing else like it. In terms of raw quantity, as I already said about the NYPD, there are petabytes and petabytes and petabytes of data, and the data grows exponentially every year. Qualitatively, there is no other source of data that is as rich and nuanced in its capturing of innumerable interactions between community members and officers under myriad circumstances, some of them tragic, some of them banal, some of them funny, and everything in between. So the first thing that I try to do when I have conversations like this is say, look, before we even go into the technology, as a society, given the fact that we are collecting and sitting on this massive trove of data, what social, political, legal, and other imperatives exist to do something with this data? I would submit to you that to collect this kind of data, this quantity and quality of data, and do nothing with it is morally and socially irresponsible. You can't just collect it and let it sit there and do nothing with it. In fact, I would submit to you also that if you can imagine a private sector company that recorded data of this size and quality and did nothing with it, the company would probably go broke, shareholder value, share value would plummet, and people would be fired in droves. So right now, we've broken an impasse in what's possible with the analysis of body-worn camera data. For years, what to do with the data was really a moot point because no means existed beyond random searches, hand coding, and things that are so laborious and so intensive in terms of dollars and hours that they're just not tractable at scale. So the question that Prathi and I want to pose to you is, where do we go from here, right? Given the fact that there is new AI technology that allows for the large-scale analysis of this data, what do we do with that? Prathi and I talk all the time to all kinds of different people, everybody from civil rights activists to cops to prosecutors to defense attorneys to mayors and researchers and everybody else. And it always troubles me when I encounter otherwise very smart people who nonetheless want to take that gut reaction of being the ostrich with his head in the sand and say, I don't want to talk about AI, I hate it. And I tell all those folks, look, the technology is here. It's not going away, whether or not you put your head in the sand. But folks with whom you may disagree, folks whose interests and values may be diverging or even conflicting with your own, they're talking about this technology. So why don't we all take a seat at the table and think through what can be done with this data in a way that reasonably addresses the collective interests of people in a democratic society who want policing to be as safe, equitable, and just as possible. Let me just sort of step back and channel my inner social scientist and ask you all to think about what you're doing right now. Although we are in various parts of the country, just talking to each other across the ether on Zoom, nonetheless, what's happening right now is a live social interaction. Each of you right now is doing the following, right? You're looking at my behavior, I'm looking at yours, right? And so we're monitoring each other, such as is possible over a Zoom call. You're listening to what I say, and you're listening to how I say it. And wrapped around all of this is some kind of context, right? So you have this wider awareness that this is part of the symposium. Jesselyn has convened this. You know and respect Jesselyn. You trust that Prathi and I are probably not too crazy because otherwise Jesselyn wouldn't have invited us on here. So there's some baseline data and metadata that it informs your natural capacity to analyze social interactions. Every social interaction is not simply the arithmetic sum of the actions of each individual. Rather, it represents the totality of a dynamic system which continuously changes in dialectical fashion. So what's happening right now cannot be reduced to, well, Jonathan's a primary speaker right now, and this is what he said, and here's what it means. if we really want to understand this small dynamic system of a few of us on this call, we have to collectively analyze what's going on and think about the wider context. Simply put, what Polis does is use AI to approximate, and I'm going to highlight approximate, to approximate human observers and analyze body-worn camera video. Now, I said to you early on, I have a lot of deep-seated reticence about what technology can and can't do. And I don't think that the technology we've built or any technology that anyone's ever going to build today, tomorrow, in 1,000 years will replace human judgment and discernment. However, given the reality that we're recording all this data and that there's enormous value in it, there are good ways we can use this technology to look for important patterns and surface those for closer human scrutiny. So I often use the analogy when I talk about this of medical diagnostics. So in effect, what we do is use AI to measure trends in human interactions the same way you can measure the ups and downs of blood pressure. Now, continuing that analogy, we are not in the business of diagnosing, right? A medical lab analyzes, it doesn't diagnose. So when you go to the doctor, you get a blood draw, you get whatever test, the lab sends the results. The lab doesn't say you're healthy, you're sick, you're a good person, you're a bad person. The lab says, here's some data. You need to take this data and sit down with your healthcare provider and talk with that person about what the data mean with respect to you. So what we're really doing is taking data and giving it to communities and police departments and other stakeholders for their further scrutiny and their action consistent with their values, norms, and objectives. A brief overview of the AI analysis of body-worn camera video. I'm going to reduce lots and lots of complexity to just a few bullet points. So the early analysis of body-worn camera footage, as I already said, relied on hand coding. Some of the studies, some of you, for example, are probably familiar with the work of Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford University around bias and traffic stops. Her lab and other labs early on have had to subject hapless graduate students to the experience of watching video after video after video and hand code all of it. To give you an example of how inefficient this is, I was talking with a colleague of mine who does body-worn camera research recently, and she estimated that her lab to hand code 500 videos took them over 2,000 hours, basically the equivalent of one person year of labor. So clearly unsustainable and insupportable for anything at scale. The second generation of AI analysis of body-worn camera footage relies on fairly limited, simple technology, which does things like transcribe officers' speech, and they use natural language processing to make inferences from the content of people's speech on what's going on. There are some insights that can be gleaned from this approach, but they're very limited for a host of reasons that sort of go beyond the scope of this conversation, but they're best summarized in saying that a limited look at the meaning of officers' speech is too detached from reality, right? So compared to what all of us are doing now in vivo, transcribing one speaker's language and making inferences about the state of the interaction as a whole, it's too abstract and too detached. So where we are today is in the beginning of the third generation of the analysis of body-worn camera footage. And that generation we can call multimodal AI. Multimodal AI takes a big step closer to what real people do in real life. Multimodal AI is simply taking different kinds or different modes of artificial intelligence and merging them together into a simple system, not really a simple system, but a single system. So what my colleagues and I do is we use three things. First, we use computer vision to look at behavior, at changes in emotion, at the intensity and quality of an emotion, to look at certain kinds of key actions. Is somebody lying down? Is somebody getting hit? Is somebody pulling out a weapon? And so on and so on. We use speech processing, which looks at how people are speaking, right? So am I speaking in a way that suggests sincerity, engagement, or am I being detached and aloof and condescending? There's a huge difference between, hey, good morning, everybody, and good morning. So the semantic content of language alone is a very limited snapshot of the interaction. And third, we use natural language processing to examine the actual content of speech, or what did people say? What's the meaning of it? So there's the linguistic, which is the meaning, and the paralinguistic, which are all of the features, prosody, pitch, tone, that go into the quality of speech beyond its content. Um, the other thing that's unique about what we do, for us, the unit of analysis is not the individual officer or community member, it's the dynamic system comprising the interactions between those two people or more people if there are more in the interaction. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so I know we're sort of having you drink from a fire hose, but hope you'll have some good dialogue. So how do we, given everything I've said so far, how do we move from distortion to real social value? By distortion, I mean that there are lots of very smart, very well-educated, and in many cases, very powerful people who fundamentally misunderstand what police community interactions really look like. As a police veteran and as a student of policing, I'm the last person in the world who's going to paper over or minimize the limitations and failures of policing. However, in the main, we know from lots and lots of research, 97 to 99% of interactions between cops and the community are nonviolent. Force occurs on average nationwide 1 to 3% of the time. So, and obviously within that 97 to 90%, the quality of interactions varies widely. There are some that are friendly and collegial and downright fun, and there are others that are miserable and condescending and cruel, and everything in between. But like any other human activity, things cluster to a norm, and most police community interactions are pretty benign. So from where I sit as a social scientist and as someone who's just generally fascinated with human interaction, the fact that across America, 97 to 99% of interactions between cops and the public are nonviolent, that is astonishing to me. I think that is remarkable testimony to what officers and community members are doing. And clearly, I think anybody would agree that this is not an effect of random chance, right? There are all kinds of things going on here that can and should be analyzed for pro-social benefits. So from where we sit, our position is that properly used, AI at scale can humanize policing by taking all of this data and yes, not just looking at the rare catastrophic failures or the missteps, but also to understand why almost all the time police and community members interact peacefully, even in situations of conflict and low trust. How does that happen? The technology we've developed is called TrustStat, which is a nod to the idea. I think many of you on this call are familiar with CompStat, which is the notion going back to the 90s that we really need to count criminal events in meticulous fashion and understand at a very granular level how many people were robbed, how many cars were stolen, how many things were shoplifted. For me, as both a social scientist and cop, crime is really just a proxy for mistrust, right? Every criminal event, whether it's a shoplifting or a homicide, represents a breakdown of other norms of interaction. So while it's certainly true that we need to look at criminal events themselves, what we really need to look at is trust. In the same way that in public health, we certainly need to know how many people are admitted to the ER and with what kinds of injuries. But what we really want to do in understanding public health is, what are the wider dynamics of morbidity and mortality, and how do those impact who comes to the ER? So what we really try to do is use AI technology to measure patterns of interactions and look for things that are proxies of trust, proxies for cooperation, conflict resolution, de-escalation, rapport, and so forth. The benefits to this, I think, are reasonably self-evident just listening to what I'm saying, but as we see it, this can enhance community engagement. There's value here for oversight, both within police departments and extramurally by outside bodies, evaluating performance of officers, training value, looking at the impacts of stress. I would submit to all of you that many negative interactions, which some folks might automatically ascribe to some kind of moral or political animus, are probably more parsimoniously explained by stress, right? Not having slept enough, working too many hours. Now, all of this, at the end of the day, doesn't come down to the AI. It comes down to people like you who are willing to go on the journey of exercising your legal and political and ethical imaginations and thinking through practically what all this looks like. So with that preamble in mind, I'm going to kick it over to Prathi to take you into the weeds on law and policy and ethics. But Prathi, I'm going to stop the share so you can take it.
Yep, no problem. Hi, everyone. Okay, bear with me. Just go ahead and start to Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Yep, you're good, Prathi.
All right, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the boring stuff. We know the desired benefits of body-worn cameras, BWCs, so we can spare all that and save some time. But what are the practical considerations? Now, I want to go back in time to 2014, which doesn't feel that long ago for me, but this is when body-worn cameras really began to proliferate. They started to go on their journey to becoming ubiquitous. At that time, law enforcement agencies were faced with the quandary of coming up with policies to deal with these body-worn cameras that all of their officers were wearing. The struggle that they had was that there was no law to really guide them or impose any requirements. Now, as law students graduating this year and next year, particularly in 2024, 2025, you are going to be facing all sorts of exponential increases in technology for which there really isn't any law that's directly on point. It puts you in a very difficult position as a lawyer to try to figure out exactly what you're supposed to do. You're kind of on your own. But I would submit that that's not really new, because every time there's a new technology, there isn't law that's on point, okay? And there are ways to deal with it. Now, what they had to deal with in 2014 without any law were three major questions. They were like, okay, let's try to process all this. What do we really need to answer? Operational procedures, meaning when do we actually have to turn this camera on and when should we turn it off? Seems like a basic question, but if you don't have a law telling you when to do that, you're kind of on your own to come up with the answer. And it's not as simple as you may think. Ethical considerations. What are the privacy implications here? Okay, law enforcement officers, by nature of what they do, walk in on some very traumatic, embarrassing, personal situations. And if you're wearing a camera, it's really, really different than pre-2014 when you didn't have a camera. Suddenly it's all right there. And then data retrieval and management. How do we store this footage in a way that is accessible and retrievable, either when we need it or when we're required to access it? So, as I mentioned, there were no laws that were directly on point, but there are laws, okay? There are analogous laws. There were back then. And this will apply again to you all now when you think about AI, because similarly, we don't really have laws that are directly on point with AI, but you can go and you have to go back to the root law of what it is that you're looking for here. So when you go back to the roots, you have privacy laws, okay? Privacy laws are critical to understanding when you should turn on a camera, when you should turn it off, and when you should release footage, okay? Now, privacy laws with respect to transparency, which legislatures and law enforcement officers all want, you need to be able to handle personal identifying information and health information as an officer, and that should really inform your decision as to when you're going to turn that camera on. Access and storage. They didn't have specific laws on body-worn camera footage, but they did have laws on government records and how they should be stored, how long they should be stored. Those are usually dictated by state and federal law, and when they should be released. There are freedom of information laws. Many of you may already be familiar with this, but just in case any of you aren't, public agencies, government agencies are presumptively required to turn over their government records to the public if there's a public interest. There are very specific exceptions. They are usually enumerated exceptions, and the government has the burden to prove that that particular exception exists. Now, it may not be called freedom of information everywhere. It could be called the public records law or the open records law or something like that. But it's basically all freedom of information laws. You do have to, as a law enforcement agency, turn this stuff over. Then you have laws on training. You do need training programs to ensure that the way you're handling this footage is in compliance with legal requirements. But as I mentioned, there weren't any right back then. So back in 2014, this is what the ACLU had to say about privacy. It's far better as a policy decision to mandate that the encounter be recorded and deal with the unwanted video. Because if a situation goes bad quickly and there's no footage, the officer is definitely in trouble. So even despite these privacy considerations, the ACLU was like, let's just lean towards let's get everything on video, okay? So where does that leave us with respect to activation? We have general laws, and they come out now with respect to state laws on activation and secession. Back in 2014, the way the law enforcement agencies kind of landed was a mixture of discretion and mandated recording. So if you had a traffic stop, you should be turning on your camera. If you had an incident that was starting to become contentious, you should turn on your camera, okay? Anytime that you would call dispatch for anything is probably a situation where you should turn on your camera. And other than that, they gave officers some measure of discretion. Why? Because so much of what they do is gray, like what Jonathan said. You could show up, you could have a policy that says you should turn on a camera every time you have a stop, any stop, right? But then it leaves out context. So if you show up at a domestic incident and you have this family that's all arguing with each other, and it's not really a stop, but it's this family beef, and you can just feel that the energy is going up a little bit, but there's not anything you would put in paper, that's when an officer should exercise their discretion and turn that camera on. At the same time, there are times when you should really turn your camera off. If you walk into somebody's house and they're not clothed, and you know that it's safe and you can give them some privacy to get their clothes on, can you turn the camera off? Can you move away? Yeah. But do you have to be careful and have some discretion about that? Yeah. If you believe that this individual is going to accuse you of doing something nefarious and intentionally turning that camera off right when they were undressed, then maybe that's a situation where you may not be able to exercise that discretion. It's very hard. It really depends on who you're in front of and the situation you're faced with. But generally, when you're supposed to stop recording is when all of the criteria for activation no longer exists, and when you pretty much think that the encounter is over. And during routine stuff going on during the day, you're taking a break, you're writing reports. Nobody wants an accumulation of mounds and mounds and mounds of data. I mean, as Jonathan said, there's already how many hours of data. So if an officer is recording their entire shift, it's going to be unmanageable from a storage perspective, but certainly from a retrievability perspective, to be able to find that particular incident, because you've got all these mounds of like irrelevant data. So they can go ahead and stop recording when they're doing routine things during their day that doesn't involve any kind of encounter. Another really interesting point when it comes to body-worn camera footage are two-party consent laws, which vary state to state. Every state's got something to say about it or nothing to say about it, which would mean that you can surreptitiously record, but it does impact body-worn camera footage. So in Georgia, officers may surreptitiously record a conversation. In Washington, it's pretty much prohibited, and in Illinois, it's prohibited, and these are just 3 states I randomly picked as an example. It's prohibited, but if you are providing somebody with notice, the proof of that notice needs to be recorded. And there are certain exigent circumstances where, and I'm sure by now I believe you're 2Ls and 3Ls, so you know what exigent circumstances are, but there are certain exigent circumstances under Illinois law where you can go ahead and record without the other party's consent. But this was something that law enforcement agencies had to consider when they were developing their policies back in the day. Okay, so how did this actually come to fruition? Let's come all the way to 2023, 2024. It's been many, many years. Body-worn cameras are everywhere. How have we dealt with this, really this tension between privacy and transparency? It's a really tough question, and courts have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So I want to give you a couple of more newer examples. It actually will show you that the laws haven't really become that fleshed out after all this time. Okay, so NYLPI, that's the New York Lawyers for Public Interest versus the NYPD. In this case, a landlord concerned for the welfare of one of his tenants, who he hadn't heard from in several days, contacted the NYPD to conduct a wellness check at his apartment. He provided the police access to the apartment. When they gained access to the apartment, they found Mr. Richards, a college student from Jamaica, experiencing some sort of a mental health crisis. He was standing in the corner of his bedroom with sunglasses on and holding what the officers believed to be a weapon. 8 officers, I believe, were present, and they all wore body-worn cameras. The encounter lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which the officers repeatedly asked Mr. Richards to drop, I think they thought it was a knife at this point, or they said he would get shot. He just stood there, completely still, completely silent. I mean, he's clearly having a crisis. At some point, an officer with a taser enters the room, and Mr. Richards, I believe, raises his hand, and right as this is all happening, the officers all shoot. Everybody shoots. There's multiple shots, and Mr. Richards is killed. The NYPD disclosed footage of the shooting in response to FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, but they blurred the faces of witnesses, claiming that it constituted an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy and could endanger the lives of witnesses. Now, hold on to that for 1 second. I will want to go back in time and tell you that the technology to be able to redact video and blur faces either didn't exist or wasn't affordable when body-worn cameras were first becoming prolific. So you have to consider from a law enforcement agency's perspective, they know they are required to turn over this particular footage, but usually under Freedom of Information laws, if part of it is available for the public, but part of it can be redacted. What that meant not so long ago was a piece of paper with like a black marker that you would literally redact this personal private information or something that wasn't discoverable or that you could release under freedom of information law. So you're going from a generation of people that were blacking things out with marker to having to redact video. It was really difficult. It was difficult even at the NYPD, and they had an enormous budget. But anyway, moving forward to 2018, 2019, the NYPD went ahead and they blurred these faces. They said that this would endanger the lives of certain witnesses. Now, endangering people's lives and violating personal privacy, those would be exemptions, okay, under FOIA. They also claimed that Mr. Richards' body and the scenes of the blood in the room and the scenes where medical treatment was being provided, both to Mr. Richards and to the police officers on scene, were not supposed to be released under FOIA based on privacy exemptions. So the question for the court was whether 18 minutes of the redacted footage was consistent, that redaction was consistent with FOIA. New York law defines an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy with a list of non-exclusive examples. So the court had to decide whether any invasion of privacy was warranted by balancing the privacy interests against the public interest in disclosure. This is the court's decision. Okay, so NYPD makes this decision, what they think would be the right decision initially, the people that are in charge of releasing footage, and then ultimately it went to court, and the court had to decide this. NYPD argued that the public interest, which is crucial to FOIA, ended when the shooting occurred, when the shooting ended. Okay, so everything that happened after the shooting wasn't in the public interest, so they could redact it or withhold it. Okay, and that there were privacy implications, as I mentioned. Now, it's important to note, Mr. Richards' family consented to the disclosure, so you should know that. As for the public interest, The court ultimately found that the public is interested in the entire incident because understanding the NYPD's response after the shooting goes to transparency. And so the footage was required to be released. So let's move on to the next case. We have the Fraternal Order of the Police. We have a union, okay, versus the District of Columbia. In the summer of 2020, when many, many laws were changing everywhere, state and federal, the Council of DC enacted the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Emergency Act. It required the mayor to release the names and footage of officers involved in serious use of force incidents and officer-involved deaths since 2014. The union sued, and one of the grounds was that the legislation violated a fundamental right to privacy, that the footage contained personal, private information about DC citizens. It would allow criminals to see who witnesses are and interfere with criminal investigations. Interference with criminal investigations is also an exception sometimes to law enforcement release of FOIA, and threaten witnesses. Fundamental privacy, this is really interesting. They were originally basing their case on Roe, and then Dobbs has decided, and then that changes their entire argument regarding fundamental interest of privacy, which I thought for law students, you might find that very interesting. Anyway, so they were really arguing, in addition to what I just said, that there was a privacy interest in the officers, right? These are officers who have footage of themselves now that can just be released all the time. And the court held there really wasn't any interest, fundamental interest in privacy for the police officers and their names and videos being released, because the police are public servants and there's a recognized public interest in information concerning police, public officials. Not to mention the fact that there's generally a recognized First Amendment right in just recording police. So if you have your cell phone out and you're recording them, that's generally a First Amendment right. So if you as an officer know you can be recorded, and you as an officer have to display your name and badge and all these things, already it starts to chip away at an argument that you have any fundamental right to privacy in that video, okay? So in that case, that union lost. Now, what about citizens? This is the third. So the first case we talked about, LPI versus NYPD, was the NYPD redacting footage saying there were privacy implications. The second case was about privacy implications for the officer. Now, the third case we're going to talk about are just general citizens. In Foster versus Chatham County, if I'm pronouncing that right, two parents requested release of body-worn camera footage that contained a father's allegation that a male relative had committed sexual misconduct against his special needs son. So he had made this allegation. It was on camera. It was on body-worn camera footage. It was captured. An investigation took place, and ultimately no charges were brought. The parents took a lot of issue with this, and subsequently there was a lawsuit that was filed. And as part of that lawsuit, that father wanted access to that body-worn camera footage. Okay, so whose privacy interest is really implicated? The father wants access to his own interview, right, with the police that was captured in body-worn camera footage. This case took place in New Jersey. Now, one exemption to the New Jersey Open Public Records Act is confidentiality. Confidentiality exists to protect innocent persons whose names have been mentioned but have not been charged. So it's the person that was accused. Disclosure of records concerning a person who was ultimately not charged implicates the integrity and effectiveness of law enforcement efforts for the benefit of the public. This is what the court ultimately decided. It weighed against public interest because it could theoretically cause witnesses not to come forward. So the footage here in this third case was not released in the interest of privacy of the accused person who was never charged. So these privacy questions, I'm bringing this up because, you know, there's a lot of focus on this. It's a mass media question. You know, you should release the footage. You shouldn't release the footage. A lot of times it's police departments that are making these calls. You can see that they get a little bit tricky when they go to court, right? I mean, it's not black and white all of the time. You could seriously understand the parents' perspective here, but then you also have somebody who wasn't ultimately arrested for whom there was no probable cause, and their name is out there in this kind of allegation, a very serious allegation. So this is just an example of what the courts have looked at. Okay, so let's talk about some best practices for reviewing, storing, and analyzing body-worn camera footage. There's a lot to consider when it comes to whether officers can review footage before writing a report. We're going to get to that later. I want to talk about data redaction and security. Delaying the release of footage sometimes allows investigators to find witnesses. It really does, and interview them, right? Because imagine if the video goes up and goes viral, it can actually implicate sometimes negatively certain witnesses. So there's an argument to delaying the release. At the same time, as we know from the case law and the news, you really do want a short-term deadline to releasing this kind of footage because it mitigates public demands for information and avoids appearance of impropriety. Now, one thing I was telling you before was the ability to redact video was inaccessible for many agencies, and the ability to blur faces, think of minors, was also not a realistic technological possibility for a lot of law enforcement agencies. So when it comes to review protocols and redaction and security, it got very, very complicated. And then you had training on footage analysis, how do you provide officers with proper training? Pretty much many policies say, let's review this. You supervisors can review or cannot review body-worn camera footage for training purposes, but whether they say they can or can't, none of them say how. So let's talk a little bit about the laws regarding whether an officer should review footage before writing a report. This is a very controversial topic. Should you allow officers to review this footage? Well, the most common approach is to allow officers to do that without restriction, which would be similar to the Florida law that we have up here, that they can review the BWC video prior to writing any or all reports. Now, the core concern relates to the potential for officers to base their reports on BWC video. On one hand, an officer writing up a report, like a burglary report, would actually be at an advantage to reviewing that video footage. They would get some of the details that they had forgotten correct, and they could put that in their report. Or an officer writing a driving under the influence arrest might benefit from reviewing body-worn camera footage to accurately record the ways in which the motorist failed, field sobriety tests. Now, use of force reports are a different story. The question here is whether a reasonable officer would change their report based on what it is that they saw in their body-worn camera footage. And the obvious concern is about deception, right? Is the officer then going to change their report for their own benefit? What Illinois did was say that an officer can generally review footage prior to completing a report, except in these three major situations: officer-involved shootings, deadly force, and use of force that results in great bodily harm. So you have to write your report. Then if you review the video, you may write a supplemental report saying, this is my report post-reviewing the video. I forgot this or that. Or you could maybe say, by the way, I did see something. It's not reflected in the video because it was in my peripheral vision. Or one thing that I can tell isn't reflected in the video is the amount of pressure that this person was putting on my arm. Things like that, you can put in a supplemental report. You just have to note that you've now watched the video. So, states have handled this differently, but most of them tend to allow officers to review footage before writing the report. So there has always been a recognition of the need for supervisors to review footage for accountability, but also for training. Texas has actually allowed, is it in here? I don't know if it actually got off the screen. I don't know if you can see it, but Texas in 2017, it had a law on racial profiling, which provided that law enforcement agencies had to adopt a detailed written policy on racial profiling that included a policy where an agency examines has standards for reviewing video and audio documentation. Illinois enacted their own law that contained specific access restrictions that you saw in the previous slide. And this law had a particular part in it that said that any detective or investigator directly involved in an investigation I'll say may, access and review recordings. I'm going to say this, while these laws have good intentions, they avoid really difficult questions, you guys. They don't talk about how often the reviews should take place and which videos should be selected. So we're talking about arbitrarily picking these videos, and how often? Once a year? Once a quarter? Like how are you actually reviewing the videos? Both Texas and Illinois say you may review the videos for training, but no one gets into how. And I think it's because it's just so difficult from a data perspective. It's just so much data. They don't really know how to put that in a law. And law enforcement agencies have all kinds of budgets. You could have a 5-person agency and you could have the NYPD. What they can do realistically completely varies. So these laws are kind of vague. Okay, so we have the federal government getting involved in 2022. The federal government, originally with an executive order from President Biden, started to order federal law enforcement agencies to develop policies on body-worn camera footage, wearing body-worn cameras, coming up with policies on body-worn cameras, and studying, like we talked about, the advantages and disadvantages of officer review of the footage before reports. It's still very controversial. They also wanted the Department of Justice to come up with standards for an accrediting body to provide accreditation to local law enforcement agencies. So in English, the federal government was saying, if you, local law enforcement agency, get accredited, we will give you federal grants. And all these local law enforcement agencies want this money. But how do you get accredited? You have to check all these boxes. Now, what are the boxes? That's what's on the right over here. You have to have, in addition to many, many other things, a policy on body-worn camera footage that includes requirements on activation and deactivation, data storage, and requirements for recorded video access and review. This is May 2023. Now, if you go back to my first slide in 2014, they already knew they needed these 3 things, right? They already knew, and there wasn't any law. And so lots of law enforcement agencies were coming up with policies on those 3 bullet points. What the activation and deactivation requirements should be, I don't know. We're going to try to, abide by our values and our ethics. What should the data storage and retention be? We've got this tension between privacy and transparency. We're all going to do our best. Should we review it for training purposes? Sure. Ideally, yes. How often? When? Well, those details never existed before. They clearly still don't exist. As you can see from here, this is about as vague as what I originally presented to you from 2014. So we really don't have a lot of details. So with that said, I want to open it up to questions and dialogue for Jonathan and for myself. I know that that's really tough, but I would submit when it comes to AI, just like body-worn camera footage, you are not going to have a lot of law. You're going to have to go back to any law that could possibly apply and then push that into the AI, push that into the technology. FOIA already exists. Now push it into body-worn camera footage and push it into AI. Privacy already exists, push it in. And I think with all the technology you all study, you're going to have to approach it that way. Mm-hmm. So question.
Wow. What an awful lot of information, but it's so valuable. Thank you. Jonathan, thank you for kind of introducing us to the concept, the actual technology, how it's used. Prathi, thank you for giving us the background and so much of the case law about what it is that we currently know about laws surrounding BWCs, as well as pointing out what we don't know and some of the existing policies that are standing around that. In anticipation for the class today, I did ask students to try to find the policies for their local jurisdiction. I see from a raise of hands, recognizing we do have some guests who have joined us now, but from our students, raise of hands if you were able to obtain the policy for BWCs in your area. Alex and Melody? Awesome. And I should ask, were you able to obtain and review? Alex, yeah? Anything surprise you in what you learned from that?
Yeah, so I I actually had a little bit of experience with this in a class I took last semester, and then it was just review of I guess what the policy was. So in North Carolina, we're actually dealing with a case about statutory interpretation with this particular freedom of information law. Essentially, is what it is, and I don't want to guide the conversation in this direction. But one of the things that I noticed is that in North Carolina, it seems like the court uh, is more, I guess, lenient to the police interest in these types of videos. And that has to do with the fact that the person that's trying to obtain this information, at least in the case in North Carolina, is a media outlet rather than a person or an individual. And so my question is, in a review of the case law, does it seem to be an interest that weighs in favor of one side or the other when it comes to this type of private individual versus public, or private entity versus public interest argument? Is there a particular side that seems to be a little bit more triumphant when these cases come about? So I guess what I'm saying is, who wins? Is it usually the police department in these types of conversations, or is it the individual? Which one seems to be more favored in these types of cases?
Well, I think the short answer is I do not know, because you would have to go through this all of the states and actually review every case that, well, first of all, you'd have to assuming it went to court, right? Because think of all of the issues that happen before it even goes to court. When you get to Westlaw and Lexis, you already have a limited data set, right? And then you'd have to go and see who actually wins. My gut feeling is it weighs in favor of public disclosure, because FOIA weighs in favor of public disclosure. But as you can see, it's very fact specific. So if hypothetically, I can't think of a case like this, you had a really serious criminal investigation where the law enforcement agency could make a convincing argument that releasing this footage really is going to implicate several individuals and put them at risk, maybe. But we have a saying in trial lawyers, like a different day, a different judge. You could have the same set of facts and one judge could say yes and the next judge could say no. So it really depends.
Thank you.
Kathy, I really appreciate you highlighting the stipulation, or more providing more data around the officer's review of their footage prior to report writing. That's something that is it's one of the groundstones of the new police, the safer security DC bill that's just gone in front of the council. So something that I have been looking into. So your additional commentary on that was very useful to me. But recognizing Maryland is home for you and your background, I'm curious if you and Jonathan can talk a little bit about a headline that I saw today about the Capitol Police launching a new body-worn camera pilot program. It is only going to be the Capitol Police on the grounds, so no one inside the building will have their cameras activated. But recognizing this is a new program for them that is getting off of the ground, would you, recognizing I don't have a way of relaying this information to them, but for a new department who is getting started in this, what would your recommendations be? What would your guidance be to affecting a useful, valuable training opportunity for them based off of their deployment of cameras?
Jesslyn, I'm going to throw out some operational thoughts, and I'm going to defer to Prathi's legal expertise for the legal and policy side. But I did see the story, and I think, kudos to the Capitol Police for adopting the cameras. What we're working very hard to do with departments around the country, and I've tried to convey it on this call, is to get agencies to think more broadly about the value of the cameras and what they capture. And as I said at the outset, national conversation around body-worn cameras has been hamstrung and distracted by a distorted negative paradigm of what most police interactions look like. And so for us as folks who don't just build technology, but think about using technology to optimize human performance, how do we identify and replicate patterns of success and not just see the cameras myopically as a gotcha tool, right? Because look, cops make mistakes. Most are, most are unintentional. Some are malicious, as within any field of practice. But we are trying to get everybody in the conversation to think more broadly about the real value of the cameras, which is far broader than seeing them as a risk management tool. There's a lot more to the conversation that. So my 2 words to the Capitol Police would be think broadly. Prathy, you're the lawyer. You get to deal with the gory details.
Well, as we know, the law is not that detailed and specific. I would say that, I agree with when you're at your question, Jesselyn, if I understand it, is what advice would you give them from a training perspective as they're entering this new program? I would say this, when you are, I agree with Jonathan that I don't like using anything as a gotcha. And that could come from being a civil trial attorney where, discovery is open. You're not there to play gotcha. You're there to get to the truth. Let's try to come up with a productive way to move forward as a society and do things better. So, our body-worn camera is good for accountability and to catch people who are doing bad things. Well, if you think about students who may cheat on a test, yes, like putting in measures to prevent cheating is going to prevent a percentage of kids that we're going to do that, or students from doing that, right? But then there are these other students who were never going to cheat, but still need to improve and still need to learn, right? They need to learn. Now, is that measure of accountability and catching someone going to teach that other 80%, I'm just throwing out a number, how to learn and be better? No, you have to teach them how to learn, usually based on something positive. Learning is a positive thing. So I would say if you're accumulating all this data, if you're starting from scratch right now in 2024, try to learn from the data, like what Jonathan said. Try to learn from positive things. You don't learn very well from what not to do. You don't teach little kids what not to do. You really need to teach them what to do, right? In that, you're going to talk about what not to do. Take the data and use it for something positive. The negative should naturally be fleshed out with that. So that's what I would say as far as training. Mm-hmm.
I love that. Thank you. John Black, thank you for joining us. Do you mind introducing yourself along with your question?
Yeah, I'll say hi to John because he's probably the only one that knows me. I am not a lawyer, full disclosure. I'm an expert witness in police practices, and I'm also a forensic video analyst. I literally use BWC footage every single day in my work. What I find interesting about this, and I applaud the conversation, I'm a part of ABA, I'm also part of NACDL. I believe you guys are where it starts in the understanding part. So we talk about learning. Prathy, you just mentioned it. What I find curious about it is we have a lot of conversations about who should have it, where it should be stored, what its privacy rights are, and everything else. But how about the viewers of video on understanding what its limitations are, what it does, what it can't do? Because, and again, my doctoral degree is in how we do decisions, my postdoctoral is in psychology, all these other type of things. What I find more often than not, and John alluded to it, is there's a misalignment with what our expectations of video was supposed to accomplish. This high degree of accountability and everything else. And Prathy, you just mentioned it's not going to make the 80% learn any better. Well, that's a problem with reason. And so what I'm curious to the group, everybody here, is there a way before we start rolling out the next thing or this or that or the other stuff to remind people to think about their own thinking when they watch video? And I'll give you a very short example. Right now, you guys, most of you are staring at a fixed focal length that never changes, two-dimensional flat screen of something. And yet every one of us is in a three-dimensional space. And our mind is giving aspects of distance and closeness. Our mind is able to see the same thing at 3 feet that's at 50 feet. We have no idea what the other person is attending to, where their eyes are actually focused. Some of you are probably staring down at your phone right now and not listening to me. I get it. It's all fine. But what happens when the citizen says right there, or the cop says right there on this? That is not a problem with the video. It's not a problem with privacy or anything else. It's a problem with logic, reason, and thinking about what we're actually looking at. And we're not taught how to do that. So whether it's legislative, training, policy, culture, I'm curious what the group thinks about what I call the upstream problem is how we think about video, regardless of what we do with it. That's my 2 cents.
John, I'm going to throw a couple of things out and I want to yield to the rest of the group. But first of all, many thanks for taking time out of your busy Friday to be here. You know, I know you and I share a lot of common ground on these questions. And to go back to something I said earlier in the conversation around the analogy between video analytics and diagnostics, right? The difference between analysis and diagnosis. I think a big part of what we need to do is get the policing world to exercise the same kind of precision, focus, diagnostic rigor, and method that we have in the medical world, right? Because I try to make a bright line distinction between analysis of footage and diagnosis, right? So the AI we're talking about, our AI can identify key patterns in interactions, but we can never replace a discerning human mind, which needs to take that data and frame it around something. And that requires the sorts of skills that I know are near and dear to you. But with you know, the technology is only as good as the people who use it. And without those diagnostic and analytic and logical skills, it's for naught.
Yeah, so John, just respond to it. You and I have had these conversations, and to all the other people here, students in law and trial litigation and everything else. We're in a really weird place nowadays in that, and probably this goes back to your conversation, it's not the same way it was in 2014. But what I'm getting at is we have a glut of data. We have, I would argue, a dearth of people that know how to think about it. And I'm running into more problems in the courtroom with a reason problem, a thinking problem, not a fact problem anymore, not the absence of something. And it's seeming to show up. And so here's just another group, and Jess, not to derail this stuff, but we've talked about BWC for cops, but people are running around every day with their own personal BWC. So the idea of citizen and citizen and completely different sets of prevailing prior case law. What do we do with privacy if we can't even get that, which is a governmental interest, compared to a citizen on citizen? You think it's fun now? wait till some of those cases hit. But again, just some thoughts. But yeah, John, I agree.
I have a couple of responses. Well, the government has a different onus on it when it comes to privacy, right, than a private citizen would legally. But with respect to what a video can capture and how to analyze it, which I think is where you're going, right? Like a video doesn't necessarily capture everything. I would say, as a trial attorney, anytime any witness, whether the witness is a camera or a person, is retelling a story, you are always going to be missing something. So 100 years ago in trial, you'd have a witness sitting up there, they're telling a story, and you in the jury box just have to envision it. Are you going to envision part of it incorrectly? Probably. Or are you going to miss part of the information? Yeah. And sometimes even today, when you have a witness up in the witness stand, you have to get them to come down and physically show me, how was that person, because none of us can envision it no matter how articulate that witness is. The same thing applies to audio. You can have audio that, it doesn't capture the entire scene. There could be somebody standing there that's silent, that's impacting the entire interaction, and that's not captured on the audio. And the same thing goes for video. I would submit that when it comes to the holes in video, that is something that has to be explained in a trial, depending on which side it is and what they're trying to explain. Hey, there's 3 videos capturing this event. Remember, you can't see this, you can't figure out that, etc. There needs to be human review. the way artificial intelligence governance the conversation around it is that the most responsible artificial intelligence contains an element of human review. I think that's really important in just that because it requires human review. It doesn't even need to build in the human review. It's already built in. It's flagging the footage for human review because human beings should have the sense that like, this is what I'm seeing. Make sure I remember what I'm not seeing or hearing and the holes in that. And hopefully the humans that are reviewing the footage or the attorneys that are arguing about the footage in court, whatever the situation is, can highlight that. And then people have to make the decision that they've always made, whether it was 100 years ago when there was no video or today when there is video. They're either going to believe it or they're not going to believe it based on themselves. That's their right, right? As a jury or as whoever it is that wants to make their judgment. We may disagree with them, but it's nothing new. I mean, now it's video, but before it was testimony.
So I don't disagree with you per se, but I think there are a little bit of your analogies that have shifted. And what I'm going to say to that is one of the weird things about the way we as humans process something is we can't unsee something per se. So now think of you as a lawyer, you're making your argument, you're your advocate as you're supposed to do by your canon of ethics. We say right there, that gun, see? And it was X amount of seconds ahead of time. The jury at that point will always see the gun because you told them where to look for the gun. They cannot unsee the fact that the gun was there. In a good opening statement, we watched this video being played. From that point on, every one of their questions or interrogatories, internal or otherwise, has to take into account, well, they know the gun, so how come the officer didn't know the gun? How come this? And so I'm not arguing. I agree with your premise, and I like your term. It's just another witness. What we have to respect is if it's a witness that has a recording of a human witness. And so this witness is omniscient. It's passive. It's not looking in one direction or anything else. There's recent studies that show over 80% of the time, well, over 70% of the time, the body-worn camera isn't even facing the same direction that the eyes were. Yet we as a person watching it think, oh, that's what the officer saw. And I know what it meant because I'm only there because I know the outcome. I call this the Heraclitus paradox. Same river, same man. You get it twice, right? So the thing is, even the officer can't unknow the outcome when he's writing the report. So it's a very weird thing. It is an omniscient eye, passive, that's recording everything, regardless of it, the attendance. And once we show it to the jury, once we bring it in, it can't be not seen again. So I would agree with you in part, but I think it is different than describing it as a similar piece of evidence or just another type. It has certain inherent qualities that I would argue really haven't existed up to this day in the same way.
Yeah, and I just want to tack on, I mean, on this Polis Solutions website, right on the front of it, we're seeing like this augmented reality kind of overlay on top of the body-worn camera footage, and these further tags, if you will. And you got to ask for a jury, are we going to start presenting this AR overlay, for them to review as well? Does that further change things? And I think courts would be, I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen no matter what. We're going to get more information to juries. We're going to get more, these AR kind of indicators, and it's going to be tricky for courts. My research has been about police use of deceptive practices and interrogations, and reforming some of the body-worn camera footage used in the interrogation. And one psychologist suggested, well, we need to just take that body-worn camera and put it in a neutral part of the room to sort of address some of these biases for courts to review. But again, going back what I first said, when you start having these AR overlays, I mean, that's a whole nother story in addition to putting the camera in a neutral position. Now we're starting to get flags for people to, it could be red, a red flag. That's all fine and good, but that's certainly, what John Winder said earlier about, we don't want to necessarily be giving too much analysis and being too determinative. And that's a big fear, I think, of my generation with AI. We see where it's going. We see that it's not just illustrative, providing good diagnoses, but we're starting to see that the big fear and concern is that it's going to be determinative and too persuasive for unsophisticated juries. And yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. I think everyone agrees more information is better. We still got to do stuff with it. But I wonder, do we have like a pure video? Is there such a thing? And then like the AR one with all the
Derek,
tags,
let me just clarify a confusion on your part. We don't do AR. That's not an AR overlay. That's nothing more than an aesthetic representation of how the computer vision picks up skeletal motion. So you can blame me personally for that because I am the CEO of the company, and that's just my decision to put something eye-catching on there. But it's not AR. It's just a pulling back.
No, sorry, I confused the terms. But
no,
regardless,
that's okay.
the overlay could be presented to a jury, or with any of these tags.
I mean, I can tell you that the overlay is sort of it has no probative value any more than understanding the inner workings of a medical test does. And by the way, I'm going to just offer perspective. Apologies, I got to jump in 2 minutes to go pick up my kids. But I just wanted to clarify that. So Derek, that's just enticing aesthetics and not an actual representation of what the product itself looks like. So again, blame me for that.
Well, recognizing the time, I think we are at a good place to wrap up. Prathi, Jonathan, thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and passion to this conversation today. I think it was incredibly valuable in shaping our understanding, both for where we are in the semester, as well as for how we want to proceed going forward. So I think we all have you've strengthened our knowledge base to better guide us in our next steps. So thank you so much for being with us.
Many thanks for the opportunity. And what I want to challenge everybody on here, especially the folks who are just on the cusp of launching a legal career, use your moral and legal imagination, right? Because it's easy. There are skeptics in all corners. Like the technology is here. We need people who have a bias for action, who will see the risk, but who will also have the intellectual and political courage to move this forward, because the technology is here, right? So, and whatever your interests, your ideology, your concerns, we can either sit impassively and squirm or say, look, we have to embrace this and move forward using the tools that ethics and law afford us, but not shying away from the mission, which is to take this data and use it for the greater good. So I think that's sort of my rallying cry for all of you. Go for it. And if you have questions, concerns, criticisms, they're our emails. We would love to hear from you. All of this is about dialogue and the use of reason. And we love hearing from everybody from all perspectives, because that's how this stuff gets better.
Thank you so much. And for those who are new to this group, thank you for joining the ABA's Legal Education Police Practices Consortium Fellowship meeting. Next week, we will be I muted myself, sorry. Thank you for joining us. Next week, we will be joined by Haley Schaefer of Datalytics. I'll drop a link to their website. We'll be starting at our normal time of 4 o'clock Eastern. It'll be the same Zoom link for the meeting if y'all want to join. We welcome more voices in these conversations. So thank you again for being with us this evening. Have a safe and fruitful weekend, and I hope to stay connected.
Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank y'all.